Good morning. Welcome to the webinar, Challenging Colonial and Racialized Inequities in Higher Education, today, April 23rd of 2024. This webinar is organized by the Canadian Sociological Association, specifically by the Policy, Ethics, and Professional Concerns Subcommittee, the Black Caucus, and Equity Issues Subcommittee. We are super happy to have you in this seminar, which will be joined. But before we start, I would like to do a land acknowledgement, and that we share the Canadian Sociological Association. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. We invite you to learn more about the territory in which you reside by clicking https://nativeland.ca. So a couple of things to engage in the conversation. We will have closed captioning available for accessibility as live transcript. And please, we ask you to please save your questions, which may be entered to the Q and answer window. We will be addressing those questions after the initial discussion. Please note that your name and question will be visible to all people attending this seminar. Attendees may upvote questions to the top of the list. We are going to have each panelist will have 15 minutes to present their to do the presentation. So that's a total of 1 hour. And then we will have 30 minutes for questions and answers as well. We will ask you to please take off your camera and mic when the panelists are speaking. And then during the questions and answers session, we will ask you to put on your camera and then ask your questions live if you prefer so. So thank you very much. And we will start the seminar. The panelists that will be presenting their work here today is Dr. Kerry Bailey from McMaster University, followed by Dr. Alana Butler from Queen's University. And then Dr. Butler is going to be followed by Dr. Beverly-Jean Daniel from Toronto Metropolitan University. And finally, Dr. Shirley and Tate from the University of Alberta is also going to speak to us. So we will start with Dr. Kerry Bailey from McMaster University. Thank you very much for being here again and happy to engage in a conversation. Please go ahead, Dr. Bailey.
Okay, just a moment as I get my video started. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I'm really excited for this opportunity to share and to learn alongside my fellow panelists. I know that everyone today is logging on from many different lands and many different spaces. I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I am privileged to live and work on this land as a guest, and I thank those who were here before us. When I was first invited to speak on this panel, my mind began swirling with the possibilities of what I might discuss. I am honored to have had the opportunity to work with and learn from Indigenous post-secondary students for more than 10 years now. Within that time, we have delved together into expanding the knowledge of what lived experience looks and feels like for Indigenous university students, and seeking to understand the mechanisms, the operations, and the social positions that collide to create those experiences. Given that Indigenous student populations are extremely diverse within each post-secondary institution, and then adding the complexities and differences of each campus context, there's no easy or simple place to start. So I decided today that my goal is really to engage all of you in a conversation about the lived experiences of Indigenous university students. There are so many critical and important insights that I would like to share and discuss, but for today's purposes, I have selected two: the current racial climate on university campuses and the importance of understanding the intersectional way lived experiences are created. Now, normally when discussing my research, I spend a significant amount of time addressing the history of Canada. I discuss both historical and ongoing settler colonial operations that persist within this country. The impacts for Indigenous peoples have been profound, both in the past as well as in contemporary times. Now, I don't have the opportunity to dive into that today at length, but I still wanted to pause and speak to the importance before continuing. I also think it's very important to highlight that Indigenous students have been working for many decades to secure access, power, and space within university institutions, battling relentlessly against the centralization of Eurocentric ideologies. Over decades and over generations, Indigenous students have shown resilience, determination, and perseverance, regardless of concerns for physical, mental, and community safety. Now, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released the final report in 2015, it was hoped that this document would support and further the work that Indigenous students, elders, and faculty were already doing. The release of the report did certainly cause a ripple effect across post-secondary institutions all over Canada. Universities began attempting to address the calls to action. Now, these changes and how they were strategically applied varied greatly depending on the institution, the province, and the surrounding racial climate. And some of the strategies, to list a few for those who may not be familiar, some of the strategies that have been applied include implementing land acknowledgements, the inclusion of mandatory Indigenous learning content, increased hiring of Indigenous faculty, dedicated Indigenous student spaces being created, and the creation of Indigenous insight committees. Arguably, these are all very positive steps. However, the outcomes from these reconciliation initiatives have not been consistent, or to rephrase, not consistently positive. Before I continue, I am going to address a few things that do appear to be consistent, potentially both within and across university campus contexts in Canada. There continues to be statistically significant discrepancies between the achieved formal education outcomes of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous individuals across Canada. Further, ethnic and racial discrimination continue to dominate campus life, resulting in issues such as exclusion, isolation, and marginality. The students that I have worked with have identified that there's not, in fact, an area of campus life where they are free from racial discrimination on a daily basis. Over 93% of the Indigenous university students that I have worked with describe experiencing anti-Indigenous racism within their university context, within their university environment. These experiences were consistently described as frequent and recurring, and occurring across all nature of experiences they had on campus, be that in the classroom, when working with professors, social interactions within the campus environment, and even when navigating the university system on an institutional level. The high levels and the nature and operation of racism were consistent across the different universities that I have worked with many individuals spending their time on campus feeling unsafe unless they were in a space dedicated to Indigenous students and surrounded by their Indigenous peers. Now, within the data, experiences with racism encompass a wide variety of concerns on university campuses, such as overtly racist comments, ongoing ignorance regarding Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, continuous microaggressions, misrepresentation or erasure from curriculums, lack of cultural sensitivity, being singled out as Indigenous representatives, denial of Indigenous knowledge as legitimate data, being exoticized or excluded, being openly denied funding for Indigenous initiatives, and mismanagement of band funding. Now, that's already a very long list, but I could continue as those are only some of the examples. Universities are often believed to be separate spaces, pockets carved out of the fabric of Canadian society where particular ideals can be chosen and upheld and equity maintained. Universities have long been held up on a pedestal in this way. However, it's naive. The anti-Indigenous racism that exists within Canadian society also invades this space, presenting in both overt and covert ways. Through my work, I had the opportunity to meet a female Indigenous student who had been working for several years towards her degree. She was determined and relentless and at the top of her class. She also held mature student status, and along with her work at the university, she also helped support her household and was raising 2 young children. And yet every single day, as she walked from her modest family home to her university campus, she was repeatedly catcalled and propositioned based on the assumption that as an Indigenous woman, she was involved in the sex trade. Now, you might be asking yourselves why I'm sharing this story when we're talking about universities. These types of ideologies, stereotypes, and racist commentaries do not cease to exist at the border to campus, and students continue to face them in all aspects of their university education. And as with outside of the university, these racist ideologies and behaviors impact university students, presenting as ongoing barriers to their success. Repeatedly in my research across different institutions, students would report their belief that the university leaders, those making the policies and the decisions, did not seem to fully understand this point. They applauded the positive and supportive changes that universities were attempting to make for both current and future Indigenous students, but noted that the impact did not always match the intent. Students shared examples of where the university had made strategic changes intended to support Indigenous students, but did not consider the high levels of anti-Indigenous racist ideology on campus, and how these changes in fact resulted in racial backlash and both emotional and physical danger for the Indigenous students rather than support. One example of this arose at a university where a policy was put in place that all students were required to take an Indigenous content component to complete their degrees. This change caused the registration for a first-year Indigenous Studies course to skyrocket to hundreds of people. And suddenly, the Indigenous students found themselves to be a small minority in a class where previously they had been the majority. The whole tone of the class changed, with increases in racist commentary and behaviors by non-Indigenous students, and the Indigenous students no longer felt it was a safe learning space for them to attend. Beyond this, there is also an issue identified within universities regarding a lack of understanding for the extremely complex and intersectional way in which lived experiences are formed. The social positioning of Indigenous university students within Canadian society is extremely complex and often goes unaddressed by these institutions in critical ways. To share one example of how this can impact Indigenous students, I would like to speak to the position of female Indigenous students who are mothers. Students holding this social position often find themselves without critical levels of support that they require for academic and personal success. For these students, the status of motherhood intersects with being female, with being Indigenous, and being a mature student. The proportion of Indigenous students that are mature students with familial obligations is much higher than within the non-Indigenous student population. Therefore, any discrimination in that area will affect the Indigenous student population disproportionately. Female students reported many significant barriers due to their social position and its complexities not being acknowledged or supported by their institution. A female undergraduate student shared with me how she had been forced to make multiple formal complaints to the university because as a single mother and mature student, there were no supports and accommodations for her. Issues such as mandatory classes being scheduled late in the evening when there aren't any childcare options available, or rigid timelines and schedules that do not allow for the flexibility that raising a young family requires. A female graduate student explained that had it not been for the support of her Indigenous student peers, that succeeding as a mother and an academic might have been impossible. She shared how she would bring her small baby to class and her Indigenous peers would take turns holding her baby and entertaining her so that she could have the opportunity to continue her learning. The support of her peers is so absolutely beautiful, but it also highlights the issue that her university institution had failed to support her. Now, most of the Indigenous students I have interviewed reported their perception that the racism they experience is the result of ignorance or misinformation due to the systemically embedded racist ideologies and practices that are present in Canadian society. Often, the Indigenous students that I have spoken with speak with a shocking amount of empathy for non-Indigenous students, faculty, and administration who carry these ignorant or racist ideologies around with them, and this level of grace was never lost on me. However, it does bring me to one final point that I would like to raise for today. There's a constant theme in my research that I feel is of great importance. Students would often clearly identify ignorance as the root cause for their negative experiences. And then, as mentioned previously, they would quietly applaud the universities for attempting to make positive change. But in the end, the students unanimously felt that their voices were being silenced, and that if only their university would talk with them, truly engage with them, then things could be better, smoother, and safer. They spoke to how they perceived their universities were selecting champions, particular Indigenous students repeatedly chosen to sit on panels and committees, and that yes, these students would do their very best to advocate. However, they felt that more comprehensive engagement and consultation with Indigenous students more widely could be truly beneficial moving forward. They expressed that the universities were not seeing them as whole people, and therefore the policies that they were putting in place geared to support them were incomplete. Now, acknowledging all of the workload that is carried by these students, be that navigating racial discrimination, academic workload, ongoing activism for current and future students, and familial obligations, etc., I always ask these students, were they really sure that they wanted the university to seek their input, to take even more of their time and energy to move through the consultation process? And they all said yes. Indigenous students want and need their voices to be heard on a much wider scale. It is felt by those that I have interviewed that this would greatly increase the success of future reconciliation initiatives within the university context. Indigenous students engage in almost constant and ongoing advocacy. They do this for current students, for future students, and one student told me that it is so hard all the time, but that she felt she owed it to her community to stay on the path and do the work. These students are refusing to accept the settler colonial project of elimination. Their work and their dedication goes far beyond admirable, but it also raises many questions. With the nationwide focus on reconciliation brought forward by the TRC, why are the levels of both systemic and interpersonal anti-Indigenous racism still so high within universities? Have the changes universities made so far remained performative rather than doing the work of unsettling? It is imperative to investigate further how and where colonial hierarchies within post-secondary institutions can be or have been disrupted, including how the changes universities have put in place are or are not improving the lived experiences of Indigenous university students. Thank you so much for listening today, and thank you for entering into this conversation with me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bailey, for such a thoughtful speech and analysis. Now the floor is open to Dr. Alana Butler, who is coming from Queen's University.
Okay, hello. Thank you very much for attending, everyone here. And also thank you, Dr. Bailey. I think a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is very much connected to some of the findings that you have. Today, I'm going to share some of my research. My research study, it was called Beating the Odds, and it's an intergenerational examination of cultural barriers to post-secondary education among low-income youth in Ontario. Wow, long title. This study, I was the principal investigator, principal investigator, Dr. Chang, and research assistants Sean Cochran and Hussein Raza. So the presentation that I'm going to present to you today includes some findings from a SSHRC-funded study about barriers to post-secondary education among low-income youth and their families. So the purpose of this study was to determine which cultural barriers, defined as non-financial barriers, were identified by post-secondary students. What on earth? I am missing, okay, I added a slide and I'm missing it, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm situated on Treaty 13. Currently, I'm in Toronto, so this is Treaty 13, the land of the Mississaugas, and is covered by Treaty 13. So I'd encourage you to reflect on the particular place that you are in and look at the particular Indigenous history where you are. And I think that Dr. Bailey, I think, quite eloquently reminded us of that. So for my research study, my questions were, which cultural barriers to post-secondary education do low-income youth and their parents or guardians identify? And how do the barriers influence the youth's decision to pursue post-secondary education? And how do low-income parents of underrepresented minority groups feel about how their values and beliefs connect to the education system? Oh, here's my acknowledgement that I put in the wrong order. So I'm not gonna repeat it again, but I did want to include that to acknowledge our traditional territories is to also recognize its longer history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies. This land was stolen from Indigenous peoples, and cities were built with stolen African labor and resources. One history cannot be remembered without the other. So for our methods in this study, I had, it was a qualitative study that we did semi-structured interviews with parents and students. Most of the high school students were between grades 9 to 12. And we had 3 interviewers. I did some of the interviews and we had research assistants. And we had, for our study, we conducted a thematic content analysis using a deductive thematic approach. So just some other notes about the data collection. I think the other slide covered a lot of it, but participants were mostly in the Greater Toronto Area, Windsor and Kingston, Ontario. They were high achieving. So one of the things that we identified in the study was the criteria for selection were high achieving, low income status students were selected, but with low income but high achieving, meaning that they had to have a grade of at least a B average as students between grades 9 to 11, meaning that they would be eligible for post-secondary education. Okay, so those are just some notes about the data analysis. I'm actually going to go, in the interest of time, go into our findings. So a lot of our findings had to do with cultural goals, career goals, cultural barriers, high school experiences, parental education, post-secondary, and their social identities. So in terms of cultural barriers, for the first part, so for this study, we did interview both parents and students. So they were dyads. Ideally, that was the target for this study, was to interview dyads. And so we had parents and students in the study that were sharing their experiences. So for the cultural barriers, so cultural barriers involve a lot of barriers related to anything related to, you know, experiences of racism, language, anything related to culture that you would face as a challenge. So students were more likely, so in the findings show that students were more likely to mention the disparity of racialized students and staff when considering the cultural barriers that they experience. So one quote here from one of our interviews, one of the students said, "Since most universities in Canada predominantly like white, most of the instructors are white, and they're not like you know, they were not like the persons coming from, is what they're saying. And it may not be, and there may not be a lot of people on campus that are Black, and there may not be some resources for Black people. I've experienced that through high school to not like resources, like Black people in general, just to meet together and talk about different things. So I know that that may come up. So what they talked about was this particular person was aware that most of the universities are, you know, predominantly white in terms of the teaching staff, and that there just may not be people on campus that reflect her particular racial identity, and that that was perceived to be a barrier for her. Parents were most likely to mention how their children experienced forms of unconscious bias from their high school teachers, administrative staff, and peers based on a lot of factors, including culture, race, and ethnicity. So one parent said, "I think the perception of him by university staff and professors might have been an issue. I think getting to university, you know, some of the things that were said about them, a lot of the teachers, by teachers, actually made it difficult to see that for each and the future for himself. So they kind of felt that sometimes the administrators did not necessarily perceive that they would be suitable for university, while also predicting similar forms of, you know, maybe negative behavior that their children may experience. There's another quote here from a parent who says, "Just because he goes to a Catholic school that are supposed to help you, but her attitude, I didn't like the way she was addressing me. I remember I thought maybe I should, you know, I should put aside or my bias against it, but sometimes, like when you try to approach the people, the way they handle you as a Black parent, it just throws you off. They're not helpful." So it kind of turned me off. So this parent of a grade 9 student, this was interview 9. This parent kind of felt like that it was a Catholic school and they're supposed to help, but they kind of felt like they weren't being helped or supported by the administrative staff. So in terms of high school experiences, parents hope that teachers, guidance counselors would support their child. A key area of importance was the selection, which we've heard about this streaming, right? The selection of applied versus academic stream courses, which helped to determine the pathways. So students spoke about the importance of it. And here's one parent who said, you know, so yes, he was in academic courses, his grade 8 teachers, but see this here, his grade 8 teachers told me he should take applied courses. I refused. He took academic. So his grade 8 teacher had already said, yeah, he should be applied. His grade 9 teacher, almost every single one of them said that were academic courses, geography, math, English, said he should consider switching of the level. So the parent was kind of recounting how they had to battle against the administration in the high school to get their student to take the academic courses that would lead you to post-secondary pathways. So other cultural barriers were different variations of education in Canada, the qualifications that may differ from the home country, and in addition, systemic barriers. So they talked about equivalency of different degrees and how this might be challenging for the students and for their children. So so this is something too that some of the families and parents felt that they had experiences some challenges with post-secondary education. One quote from a parent, he said to me, "Mom, I don't understand why they're telling me we're going to fail this course and we need to retake it. Like you're going in telling people, oh, most people fail the course, you know, fail this course and, you know, take it." So they said that this parent was recounting the students saying that, you know, the teacher predicting that they were going to be failures. So mind you, remember, these are low-income students, racialized students in the study. So social identity, geographic identity was an issue too. Here's one quote, I raised my kids in Markham. I thought it would be a safer environment, but I don't necessarily know if that really was, in the sense that it was a more privileged environment, but I don't know if it was an emotionally and psychologically a safe space for them. For race, this particular parent was, he was always aware of what happened to his brother, because he was aware. He was that kid who said to the grade 1 teacher, I know you treat me like that because I'm Black. So this parent was talking about racial awareness and how he was able to see the racism that his sibling experienced, and then it shaped how he interacted with his teachers. So there's for this study, like, we found there's significant, like, non-financial barriers to the acquisition of post-secondary schooling. So our point for this study was to show that it wasn't just about money. Providing scholarships and grants and things do support low-income racialized youth. However, there are cultural barriers that we need to be aware of. So there are cultural barriers for the students perceiving, and parents, that there's going to be a lack of representation in the higher education realm for them. Lack of awareness around it too. So this goes in part with some of the curriculum, some of the things that Dr. Bailey was talking about. The challenges that Indigenous students face in the school are very similar to a lot of racialized students as well. Parental pressures or parental experiences in post-secondary education. So the parents feeling pressure to support their children while facing these challenges. The students, their own social identity and how their geographic location played a role in that. And some students do have career aspirations that don't require post-secondary or require a certain type of degree too. And also there could be more support provided around that, which they didn't find. Exposure to post-secondary options, generally occurring in the high school setting and in the home with family and caregivers. So more work could be done to support low-income racialized families within the, in the home and also outside the home, to provide some information for them and supporting them in helping their children navigate post-secondary education. So as we see, the kind of point of the whole study about beating the odds and cultural barriers is that we hear the narrative about financial barriers and funding, tuition, and that is an important piece. However, we need to bear in mind, what is the cultural safety? What are the racial affirmations that you can provide in spaces? So for post-secondary education, are these identity affirming spaces, as Dr. Daniel, who will follow me, has written extensively about? Is it affirming the student's identity? And I think that's a key piece. And I look forward to us having discussion about this at the end as I conclude. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Elena Butler. Now is the time to Dr. Beverly-Jean Daniel from Toronto Metropolitan University to do the presentation.
Sorry. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to spend this time amongst my most esteemed colleagues. So I am not doing a presentation per se. What I'd like to do is to engage in a bit of a dialogue with you, and and I wanted to start off by sort of posing a number of questions. And so the first question that I want to pose, and as I listened to my two previous colleagues who've talked about, the experiences of Indigenous students and the experiences of Black students, and we know that there's a lot of similarity in terms of those experiences. And I often ask people to consider how is it that these two groups who have been intentionally targeted for hundreds of years, how is it that we have not had opportunities to develop more collaborative mechanisms for addressing the challenges that we see at the universities? So I want us to sort of start off by sort of remembering that or even questioning, what do we mean by colonial and racialized spaces, right? Oftentimes, each person enters these dialogues with a sense of what that means for themselves, but not necessarily what does that mean for the collective. And we often find that we are almost forced to engage in the oppression Olympics and to fight with each other for whatever crumbs fall off the table of the dominant. So the fact of the matter is that we continue to live in and function and work in academic spaces that are inherently inequitable, they're inherently violent, and they're also spaces that have managed and reproduced the colonial project. Right. So there's literally been no shift in terms of the violence that is evidenced in these spaces. These spaces continue to, as you know, privilege the worldview of the dominant. And when we look at the way in which colonialism has unfolded, what we're really talking about is the way in which primarily European groups have sought to control and to capture the wealth of the globe. And I think any conversation that we have about colonial spaces cannot be conceptualized separate and aside from issues of power, wealth, and domination. And there is this sensibility that those who continue to hold on to power are holding on to that power because of the assumed possibility of retributive violence. And what I mean by that is that there's this assumption, and if we look at it from a quote unquote biblical perspective, right, the idea that if someone does something to you, you have to then do it back in return. So even though there has been absolutely no evidence, either from Black populations or Indigenous populations, that we are going to engage in some type of retributive violence against the colonial powers, there continues to be that insidious fear on the part of Europeans that we are going to do to them what they've done to us. And we see that being expressed in the US in some ways very, very concretely today. Look at the laws that are being written. Look at whose history, because the fact that in 2024, we're writing laws that bans the teaching of African histories, that speaks to the extent to which these irrational fears of retributive violence continue to pervade the psyche of whites, right? And we see that emerging in academic spaces. So what for me becomes this sort of form of cognitive dissonance is that on the one hand, we talk about academic spaces as spaces of intellectual engagement, when in effect, the vast majority of us who are not white in academic spaces, we experience those as spaces of abject and brutal violence, right? But because there isn't necessarily that physicality of the violence as we've seen historically, wherein which we're no longer necessarily being physically lynched, we're no longer necessarily being physically brutalized, because we're using language as the form of brutalization, it doesn't seem to be as violent, when in effect, what it does is that it destroys our psyche, it destroys our ability to keep going. It essentially becomes a form of slow death and torture, but the violence is understood in a different way. And the fact of the matter is that the violence that we're experiencing, that flow hasn't been attenuated in any way, shape, or form over the centuries. And the flow of violence it continues to be unidirectional, right? That those of us who are racially minoritized are the ones who continue to be the subjects and the objects of that violence. And the fact of the matter is that the failure to change has nothing to do with the inability to change. The failure to change really continues to be about holding on to structures of power and ensuring that the structures of power never shift. The other question I want you to sort of consider is whose construction of space and belonging will we continue to privilege? And are there ways in which we can begin to invest in a project of spatial co-construction, right? And what I mean by that is we've got Indigenous groups doing their work. We've got Black groups doing their work. We've got South Asian groups doing their work. We've got LGBTQ groups. We've got Palestinian groups. We've got Jewish groups. All of these groups are doing their own work, focusing on their own communities, focusing on their own development, when in effect, we are all being exposed to the same types of violence at the hands of the same colonial masters. So at what point do we begin to strategically think through the ways in which we can engage in collaborative disruption of the spaces that we're in? I have seen in all too many situations wherein which you will have people who continue to be positioned along that, that racial spectrum, positioning themselves in relation to whiteness because of the assumption that if they can position themselves in such a way that they get more access to resources, when in effect, it really is only a temporary and superficial access to resources. It's a temporary and superficial access to whiteness and white spaces, which can be removed at any point in time. So I think we have to be very intentional in thinking through how can we begin to engage in a collaborative resistance to the violence that continues to unfold. As my first colleague talked about the experiences of Indigenous students, and I'm listening, I'm thinking, but that is exactly the experiences that Black students have talked about. That is exactly the ways in which they experience that space, even though we might be positioned in different bodies. The third question I want you to consider is, how do the forms of exclusion become repeated and replicated within universities? Right? Who sits on committees? Who are the decision makers? Who are the gatekeepers? And how does this constant narrative around sort of the pain and the instant production of tears circumvent dialogues of change? And again, my colleague talked about the ways in which when the students understood that they were primarily Indigenous students in the classroom, all of a sudden the space became unsafe for the white students. Right? And so we're seeing these highly performative strategies that are used to circumvent the dialogue around social change, and to also ensure that the balance of power remains firmly entrenched in the hands of first and foremost white men, and secondly in the hands of white women who benefit from that adjacent power. And one of the things that I have talked about and written about is the role that white women continue to play in these spaces. Because if we look at academic spaces, they are very much controlled by white women. And they're the ones who have become and continue to be significant gatekeepers to change. And whenever there are dialogues around change, we often see that circumvented by white women's tears. And Akapati talks about that work, and we really haven't seen a shift. What we do see is sort of the performativity around allyship, and the performativity that says I'm here for you and I want to support you, but in actuality, they're also the same group that's dismantling any real opportunities for change. And again, if I draw your attention to what's happening in the US, look at who is spearheading many of the changes that we're seeing, right? Who's looking to ban books? Who's talking about the way in which, if we talk about the real history of Africans in the US, what we're doing is we're hurting white children, right? So we cannot have these conversations without remembering that that white women continue to play a very, very significant role in disrupting the possibility of change. So a couple more questions that I want you to sort of think about before I wrap up. I also want us to think about again, given who is sort of sponsoring this event today, the Research Ethics Board, how are these biases and these barriers evidenced even within the research ethics context? Because what I have seen is that there are very different expectations placed on Black researchers or non-white researchers than there are on white researchers. I can speak to an experience that I had recently where I was invited to review grant applications. And I have to tell you, in as much as I knew it was happening, I still remained, or I was, in as much as I expected it to happen, I was still a bit shell-shocked when it did happen. Because what I saw was that the grants that were submitted by non-white researchers were exposed to a level of scrutiny that I did not see in the grants that spoke to issues that were relevant to white communities. So what I mean by that is people would talk about the paper wasn't rigorous, the conceptual framework wasn't solid. And I had to remind them that we as racialized researchers, we are engaging in research that has never been done. So the idea that we needed to provide a conceptual framework that fit within the ideas of white communities, that in and of itself was problematic, right? So there are so many ways in which the barriers continue to be in place. So in my last 2 minutes, I will say to you, what is your role and how are you prepared to resist? Because foundationally, this work cannot be done by the bodies who are fending off the violence. We cannot be trying to survive and trying to fight the violence and trying to uphold these existing systems. And I'm not saying uphold systems of power, because what we see happening is that there's almost this, I refer to it as a plantation economy within the academy, wherein which anything related to equity comes to Black and Indigenous folks for us to do the work so that the institutions themselves can then put out statements as to how equitable they are and how inclusive and how diverse they are. But if you look up the food chain, you still see that the balance of power hasn't shifted. So what are you actually prepared to do? Are you actually prepared to challenge? Are you actually prepared to do the work? How do you step away from and outside of performative and parasitic allyship and recognize that those forms of allyship are of zero benefit to the communities that you claim to be wanting to serve? And for me, part of my resistance has been me limiting the energies that I invest in building that plantation economy within the academy. And so much more of my work is now, really invested and targeted towards how do I develop the communities that I work with, how do I develop the students that I work with so that I can empower them to take on the next phase of the journey. So as I wrap up, like I said, my last question to you is, and how are you prepared? And what are you prepared to do to actually challenge the colonial and inequitable structures that we see in our institutions? So thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Beverly-Jean Daniel, for this awesome invitation to think and act in the context of post-secondary education. Now is the turn for Dr. Shirley Ann Tate from the University of Alberta.
Thanks a lot, Eloy. Thank you also, colleagues, Kerry, Alana, Beverly-Jean, for your words. I really appreciate them a lot. And I've learned a great deal from your presentations as well. I want to do a land acknowledgement for the University of Alberta because that is where I am located at the moment on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people whose presence, histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our vibrant community. I want to start with 3 propositions. The first of them is that the knowledge of the university we occupy refuses to be decolonized and to be anti-racist. That's my first proposition. My second one is we, as academics, are the university. So we are the refusers of decolonization and anti-racism. And my third proposition is that this means Indigenous sovereignty will not be acknowledged, reparations will not be made, reconciliation will be incomplete. And these are some of the propositions that I've been working on for a while, maybe over the past few years, but I finally began to voice them. I want to look at what these propositions can mean for people of African descent, for Black feminist thought, and also for knowledge systems which refuse decolonization and refuse anti-racism. I want to start with Jamaican cultural theorist, novelist, playwright, academic, and reluctant Black Caribbean feminist, the Honorable Sylvia Wynter, OJ. OJ is Order of Jamaica. She's been honored by our shared country. She said in 1994, "We cannot, as a population group of African descent, wholly or partly, expect any other result but our continued degradation and global disempowerment within the terms of our present conception of the human man, and the order of knowledge by means of which this conception is elaborated. As the other to this conception of the human, the cultural messages of the order of knowledge which elaborates this conception must by necessity be hostile, not only to our realization, but our survival as a population group." She ends this with, "It is it or us." Sylvia Wynter has really great ideas, I think, on the diacritical and demonic, which she developed initially in her critique of white feminism. And I think these ideas are particularly useful for thinking through what we need to wage war on, and also how what that can be done or is being done by Black feminist theory and pedagogy. That is really how we need to move forward to implement change. For Sylvia Wynter, Black women as humans and knowledge producers, knowledge disseminators, change feminist theory and feminist practice because they bring new perspectives, meanings, and approaches to what is considered theory, pedagogy, and activism. This is what makes Black women's contributions diacritical and demonic. They add new accents, so they change the meanings of words, ideas, knowledge, indeed the canon. And that's what she means by diacritical. They also operate outside of mainstream feminism and academia. That is, they operate on demonic grounds. As diacritical and demonic, Black feminist thought lifts up subaltern voices, knowledge, and praxis because of its focus on intersections that matter in and to Black life. Black thought and Black study are both demonic and diacritical, which gives us an indication of what deconstructing colonial knowledge and constructing Africa-relevant education could look like at the level of decolonial knowledge as a movement away from the Eurocentric other to the self. This means that our task as teachers, educators, knowledge producers, activists, changes from the colonial focus. It changes from the colonial focus, which is to elaborate, guard, and disseminate the kind of knowledge able to ensure the well-being of the human, called white man. Wynter urges us instead to turn to Africa as the seat of civilization, to see the fundamental rules that still govern us today. She sees this, of course, as a tremendous challenge, because this is to say that we make ourselves human through words, through meanings, through institutions. It is the way in which in Africa we can say an other exists to what the West calls human. Thus, taking this body of knowledge that has been built up by the West, but seeing it differently from them because they could not see these others as alternative forms of life is what we should be doing. We should be seeing it differently. So in instituting ourselves, we institute an order of consciousness as we become enemies of our own consciousness. We go back to Winter's "It is it or us" as we think through becoming enemies of our own consciousness. That is to say, a consciousness steeped in Eurocentricity, anti-Blackness, anti-Africanness in thought, action, and politics is our enemy. We must remove whiteliness as a transgenerational structure of domination and feeling from thought, action, and praxis. So I want to just think a little bit about what this means for African descendant people within the Western Hemisphere's order of knowledge. As you probably realize, it's a much longer paper, which I've been shortening to 15 minutes. In her Black Studies Manifesto, Winter in 1994 said that our war now was to move beyond the Western epistem, canons, bell curves, and all that. Of course, at the time that she was speaking, she was talking to the Black Studies community in the United States, but of course, beyond that also to people of African descent worldwide. At that time, she was speaking into a world in which we still find ourselves now in the 21st century, having to wage war against anti-Black knowledge systems and racist pseudoscience, what my colleague Andre Kiet calls racism's knowledge. Racism's knowledge reproduces African descendant people as irrefutably uneducable, lacking in intelligence, incapable of producing knowledge without any knowledge canons, with universities on the continent that cannot make the world rankings because they are research and teaching failures, which cannot produce well-trained graduates, etc., etc., etc. We've heard it all before. Outside of the continent, Africans and African universities and their degrees continue to be evaluated to ensure that they meet global Northwestern requirements for work and study purposes. In other words, in terms of the global Northwestern view of the African continent embedded in global anti-Blackness, colonialism's native keeps being reproduced in 21st century coloniality as knowledge systems and bodies. Let me just find my other section now. Give me a moment. Sylvia Winter has shown that human is a white European colonial invention. This colonial invention has produced and continues to produce its others globally, discursively, economically, epistemologically, politically, and I also add aesthetically and affectively. Africans on the continent and in the diaspora continue to be non-human, as Winter outlined in her open letter to her Black Studies colleagues. I go back to the quote with which I started. It is it or us. It is the order of knowledge which produces the inner eyes of the humanities and social sciences, through which we see reality defined as optimally white and middle class as the only truth, the only knowledge worth knowing. The reverse of this is, of course, the constructed infrahumanity of African descendant people. This truth is the it spoken about by Winter. This is what we must battle against to become us, to become human, to survive as a population group within the continent or in the Black Atlantic diaspora. Our survival was not and still is not guaranteed because of coloniality. It is coloniality's order of knowledge which still produces our inner eyes that we use to understand and to make the world we inhabit, whether we want to or not. Our complicity is hardwired into the system, and the non-compliant are made to suffer. Charging forward for social justice transformation at the level of knowledge is risky business, especially as Beverly-Jean reminded us about what's happening in the United States, for example. Change comes at a personal cost when we choose to turn away from Euro-American inner eyes and produce Black knowledge from Blackened thought, but turn away We must. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for all the presenters. Fantastic presentation, thought-provoking, and I'm pretty sure the audience, just like me, are very happy about it, very excited. So now is the time for questions. Thank you so very much for your insights. Some of them that I took note of are not be always optimistic, be critical, build alliances, facilitate alliances among the oppressed populations in our universities, and carry safety with you are, I think, a great advices for those who are racialized within our institutions, and we want to survive, we want to continue thriving. And thank you so very much for your insights. I think that the audience, just like me, learned a lot from you today. Our four panelists, we want to say thank you in the name of the Canadian Sociological Association to Dr. Kerry from McMaster University, Dr. Alana Butler from Queen's University, Dr. Beverly-Jean Daniel from Toronto Metropolitan University, and Dr. Shirley Tate from the University of Alberta for all your insights. And thank you so very much as well to the audience who was here and to the Canadian Sociological Association for keeping us up to date with conversations with experts in their fields about important aspects that are related to our discipline to our everyday life. Thank you very much. This is the end of the webinar.